Right. Eric, Anthony, to kick proceedings off, what I'd like to know is why did you have to write this book?
Woke up one morning, as sometimes happens with me, with this line in my head, teaching tough executives to relate. And I got in touch with Eric and sort of said, well, I keep on having this thing in my head about tough executives having to get to the top by getting tougher and tougher. And when they get to the top, then they have to relate, and they can't remember quite how to do that. But because they can't relate effectively, they don't get the information they need and the connections they need to stay at the top, and it becomes all very tragic. And this was a conversation that Eric and I had, I think, in Kingsway, when I approached Eric for that, and I said, and it'd be interesting if we might write something around this, and agreed that we would make it an inquiry into our own experience of working with executives and our own lives. And through that, I think the book emerged.
What's your memory, Eric?
Yeah, I had my own questions about leadership. And I remember also from my first answer, and this is 4 years ago now, my recollections, a long time ago, and it took us a while to get to this book in the form it is now. I also said I don't understand leadership, I think, in my answer. I can't define it. I don't know what it is for, despite having worked for 20 years in leadership development or executive development or whatever it's called. I could not work out for myself what leadership means or what a leader should be doing or ought to be doing, or what the profession, how you can describe the profession. So I had a real struggle with the topic as well, however much I wanted to write a book with Anthony. So that was part of my first answer. And then why did I have to write it? Well, all of my clients were leaders and had been for many years. So I felt a certain obligation to understand what their profession was, or what they did the rest of their time when they weren't with me.
Great, thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn to our guests. Dennis, Kerry, when you read the book, how did it resonate for you?
Kerry, you first. Ladies first.
Thank you. I guess for me, my work with leadership began many, many years ago from my career in industry. And when I went to research the subject, it was as dense as you could possibly imagine. So trying to find something that made sense to a real leader on the ground. And this book for me really brought together such a wide-ranging thought process on leadership and how we could use it, and how actual real practical leaders could use this to do something within their own context, their chaotic contexts. It also resonated with me on a lot of other spectrums, because one of the areas which I'm very passionate about and that I work and teach here on at Ashridge is the whole area around emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And one of the challenges I face when I'm working with executives is actually to get them to learn how to feel. So one of the things I would do in the classroom is almost getting people to see what the emotion they're experiencing right now is. And I can't even begin to describe to you the difficulty that brings to some of our executives and leaders. So they've turned off that part of themselves. And what they don't realise, I guess, and what the book really brings out is understanding what's going on for you, and that awareness is one of the most important influences around your decision-making ability as a leader. And this book really brings to the fore the importance of understanding and being self-aware and taking the good with the bad and being able to do something with both and channeling it into your role as leader, whatever that context brings. So it's absolutely fascinating read for me.
Thank you. Nice.
Well, in the first place, I think I would say that I really enjoyed reading the book, and there's a lot of academic writing and a lot of books that are published these days that are very painful to read because of the style that they adopt, but this is different, using everyday language in an appropriate style. Beyond that, it resonated with me in two ways. The first is that those of you who are in good form today will pick up that I have an Irish accent, and I grew up in Northern Ireland originally at the height of what we called the Troubles. So I was always aware of the existence of very destructive leaders who were nevertheless capable of influencing large numbers of people. And that kind of phenomenon is very underanalyzed in leadership studies. In fact, some people have argued that if you have very destructive leaders, they aren't really leaders at all. And some scholars have suggested, therefore, that people like Hitler and Stalin can't be regarded as leaders because they were destructive, and I think that's absolutely nonsense. Actually, they were leaders. They just operated from a very destructive point of view, and I think it's very good that leadership studies acknowledges this and explores what the dynamics are that lead to those destructive outcomes. So if you turn to this book, it does, it might sound like something that all efforts on leadership should do, but believe me, it's rare. It actually does address things like hubris and narcissism on the part of leaders, not just as personality disorders, but how they are actually socially produced by the power relations between leaders and followers as well. And I think that's very instructive and something which we need to do more to prepare leaders to recognise. For me, that falls into the context of the way in which leadership is typically presented and taught to business students is far too simplistic because it does not acknowledge those factors. And I vividly remember, for example, the front cover of a Harvard Business Review magazine a few years ago, which was devoted to the tests of the leader. And on the front cover, they had a picture of a short-sleeved executive performing push-ups on the boardroom table. This is supposed to be what leadership is about: male, macho, tough, uncompromising, and way ahead of everybody else. To me, those are dangerous images and dangerous messages. And I think this book challenges it very effectively and points to a different path for leaders where they can be more humble, where they can practice humility, where they can recognize both where they have power and need power, but also where they should give it up for their own good as much as for everybody else.
Actually, you've nicely linked into one of the paragraphs that I highlighted from the book. And actually, we then discovered when we were talking over lunch that all three of us had underlined this particular paragraph that Anthony and Eric had written. Let me quote from it. "Stepping forward to make a leadership gesture always creates a rift between one's active, constructive side that has the ambition to contribute, create, and one's doubting, needy, and concerned side, which craves for connection with oneself and others." And how does that connect? Is that part of the heart of the book for you? I mean, it felt very important, obviously, to the three of us. But is that one of the messages that you see as being right at the heart of this?
It became clear to us at some point in our work that once you're put in a leadership role, and I say once you're put in, or you step into any act or of initiative that takes a lead, you step out and you separate. And that immediately creates a rift, a break between yourself and the others, the thing that you'd like to put on the pedestal and point to, and the things that you might have doubt about, and also the elements that perhaps wouldn't help you in making your call and putting forward the bits that would help you and the organization. And this doesn't mean that you're selfish or anything like that. It can be acting out of the very best intent. Immediately, you step into that. By definition, there is a shadow element that then gets created, and this rift happens. And that is the essence, one of the things that when we noted that, the penny kind of dropped, and the essence of what we were talking about, I think, came together. Yeah, so it is a pretty key paragraph.
Yeah, I would add it comes from the chapter we wrote last, and the chapter that has the same title of as the book. So it's about this shadow itself. So it's a defining quote for our book. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of the other things I was very intrigued about, I was very struck by your saying you didn't know what leadership was.
Yeah.
And you actually come up with a very clean definition. Could you talk me through how you came up with the definition and why it works for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's another defining moment in the writing process for us. Certainly for me, it was about halfway through, or even more recently, I think early last year, I stumbled across a clear and crisp definition, but not until I realized I was not the only one who couldn't define leadership. I thought I was the only one, because many people speak in very certain language and authoritative language, they lead on leadership almost. You know, there's a lot of leading in the literature as well. So my doubting seemed to be out of place or something wrong with me. And then I came across this book, I think it was thanks to you, John, from the 90s, which by a professor called Rost. And he surveys the whole literature and he comes up with 280 leadership definitions.
221, I think.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Only 221 out of 590 books. Yeah, so the most of the books didn't provide a definition at all, still wrote about it, but couldn't define it. But those 220 leadership definitions, he also shows that they break down in the face of evidence. So they're not very good definitions. And in the end, then I could acknowledge that I was, when a professor wrote something like that in a proper book, I could just embrace the fact that I was doubting. And soon after, we came to a much clearer definition, which we then found out was in that same book. It is there. There's an American sociologist called Campbell, who apparently is very well known in the United States, who came up with this very same definition that we have. Very short, very simple, in 1956. And it's only one of those 221. But you have to discard the rest.
You've got to tell us the definition.
No, of course not.
You can't tease
No, I'll
anymore.
tell you some of the other definitions if you like. No, because those are much more prevalent in the field. So I think most people would say that the leadership is what the leader does. So that is the most prevalent definition. You look at your leader and you say, you observe them, him or her, and you say, oh, it does this or it tells me that. Oh, that must be leadership then, and I must live with it. So there's a kind of a definition which then implicitly says, you know, the person who occupies a certain role, status or rank or salary, has it, and the others don't. So that's a very prevalent and I think toxic definition of leadership. Another one is very, I think it occupies, Ross himself says that about 100 of his definitions are the following, is when you can get somebody to do something willingly for you that you want to do. So it's about influencing or convincing somebody. So that's another definition, which is only about a behavior or a skill. It's not about leadership, and it's you need to think about what leaders provide, and after that maybe you get to the important issues around leadership.
I'm going to prompt you again. Could you share with the audience and for the camera what your actual definition is?
Okay, the camera's there. No, I think the leader's responsibility, or actually that's already I've gone off message here. So leadership is something which is completely shared by everyone in an organization. So an act of leadership is an act of enhancing the effectiveness of a team or an organization. So leadership is pushing a bunch of people or an organization up the ranking. So an easy way to picture that is just in sports, where you have rankings of teams, football clubs, if you wish, pushing yourself up the table, doing the right things or the things rightly. That is anything that contributes to that is leadership. It's very simple, but it's not often used.
And one of the really interesting things about that conversation about leadership for us in the writing process was that the moment you talked about that, like you experienced and we experienced this whole question of what was going on between us in terms of writing the book ourselves and who was leading and who was following, and what is the intention and between that, and what is it that we're putting in the shadow and what is it that we're promoting, and what we were doing with our doubts and what we were doing with our intents. And so there was a playing out within about ourselves, and in the end, the other aspect of it is becoming clear that it's actually in some ways really very much about us. And in other ways, it is not at all about us. And it's about the results. It's about how that translates into, if you take the effect of the book as an organization, how that translates into the effectiveness. How does this promote the effectiveness of leaders to work, to reflect on what leadership about, and all those aspects? That is really the important aspects of our, but in a sense, it is about us, because in our inability to deal with our own issues, to work together or whatever, we actually fail in that leadership intention.
I'm going to ask Dennis and Kerry now, and I'd also, quite soon after listen to the two guests here, I'd probably invite the people in this room who I know have fairly strong views on this matter to maybe, respond to what they've heard. So, Dennis, you first. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Eric made a moment ago about leadership being distributed and shared and dispersed around an organisation is very important. And my view is that most writing on leadership for the last 30 years has almost missed that. In particular, when you think about the theory of transformational leadership, which has been the dominant theory, it's really relentlessly emphasised the idea of powerful individuals exerting influence on other people without thinking how those people themselves are in turn influenced by others, or should be. So it's, in a way, it's legitimised the idea that power inside companies should be concentrated in the hands of a few people who are heroic individuals who it is simply assumed are wise and who are capable of making decisions for the collective without necessarily requiring much input from anybody else. And I would venture to suggest, look where it's led us. That was the model of leadership in the Royal, Fred Goodwin's organisation, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which ended up in the biggest bankruptcy in UK corporate history, where you had a regime where people didn't really challenge the leader, didn't challenge the boss. And it's not a good model for effective decision making in any way. And to me, that goes back to this idea of a rift that opens up on people when they take up a leadership role. We discovered at lunchtime that all of us are parents. And I often think about parenthood is that it brings out the very best in you, but it also brings out the worst. And when you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning screaming at your infant to shut up, you know what it is. Well, when you become an all-powerful leader in an organisation, similar things begin to happen. Somebody wrote a while ago that if you're the CEO of a corporation today, it's the nearest thing you can get in the modern world to being king of your own country. And of course, you're surrounded by fawning sycophants and courtiers, and power flows up to you. And what we need to put more emphasis on in the leadership literature, which I think this book does, is it really explores what the effects on leaders are of precisely those processes, and how by reaching beyond the conventional stereotypes of leadership, the leader can at least take some steps to ease those effects. And we need much greater awareness on the part of people stepping into leadership roles of that potential to be seduced by power, and how ultimately that impairs their decision making and their judgment as well. I think that too many leaders become like rock stars with a sycophantic entourage, and the effect on rock stars isn't good, and it isn't good in these kings of their own country either.
Well said. I guess, yes, I definitely agree with a lot of the points that have been raised, and something that is very important that we need to think about as well is the changing context that leaders are operating in. So the traditional words, the use of power, the use of the word leader in itself, and the kind of the heroic piece, and the way that organizational contexts are shifting is beyond our comprehension about what an organization is going to look like in a couple of years' time. One of the points that came out in the book was around the shortening of the organizational life cycle. So you were saying in the 1950s, organizations were around on average for about 70 years. It's now about 15 years. So it's this very short burst of activity that's happening, not very sustainable. If you look at some of the Harvard Business Review and the different practitioner literature that's out there at the moment, they're saying that companies are much more focused on shareholder profits. They're not reinvesting for prosperity. They're not really thinking about the sustainability piece. So we need to think also as well about the leader who will be needed to run those types of organizations, and changing the leadership and what it looks like and what we talk about in business school leadership, because they come to us for the answer. And the reality is we need to understand an awful lot more about how businesses are evolving. If you look at very successful businesses that are emerging at the moment using collaborative economies, so think people like Airbnb, where they're working across a spectrum, breaking all the rules, working across boundaries that we never really could have thought about a couple of years ago. So the changing context is something that needs to be looked at very, very well, and for us to then understand how the leader and all this power will fit into that structure, and if it will be effective anymore. Because people, especially the next generation, are not paying as much attention to power. It's not really something that, if you think back to our parents' time, power was a very important piece. People respected authority. It was looked up to. It was obeyed. Nowadays, it's very much, you've got knowledge workers. We're questioning everything. We're questioning the why. As leader, you can't just tell people that this is what you want them to do. They want to know why. They want to know the impact. So there's a huge evolution that's happening. And I think this book really helps us to kind of lead into that space about taking into account the changing context of where leadership needs to happen.
I'll just take the microphone off you. Just to summarise, I'd heard someone describe it as the death of deference as the title for the age. Copyright J. Higgins. Yeah. But I just want to read you another quote from Eric and Anthony's book. And it's to do with when they're talking about analysing the modern context and that produces a leader. And they say they see the following. Two related and mingled processes. One, a growing of our talents or our business. The other, an intertwined process of growing our hubris.
Can I comment as well on this importance of context that Kerry raised? Because the context that we are all operating in is getting more and more difficult, more complex. I mean, you were saying what constitutes an organisation even isn't clear anymore because the boundaries are breaking down and everything is becoming more fluid, temporally and in its physical structure and so on as well. And in that kind of context, to me, the old heroic model doesn't really, it never made much sense, but it makes less and less sense as time goes on. The idea that any one individual can know what they need to know to make all these decisions is crazy. I mean, some of you work here at Ashridge. I doubt that anybody in the room knows everything about Ashridge that there is to know. And imagine if you're the CEO of an organisation of 60,000 people pretending, because you would only be pretending that you know all that needs to be known to make effective decisions is almost mad. And one of the little paradoxes of all this is that we live in a capitalist economy, but it's wrong to think that Stalinism has died because we still have it in our boardrooms. It might not exist in the countries of Eastern Europe anymore, but we still have that model of an all-powerful, omnipotent decision maker to whom all decisions are referred up. So the paradox, among others, is that we still have this pyramid view of organisations. We're all down here, and there's some wise individual at the top who knows more than we do. And you know, it doesn't take very much experience in organisations or working with executives to realise that that's nonsense. And in a sense, I sometimes think the further up you go, the less you know about the reality of what's going on. It's quite true, literally true. I mean, if you ever watch those TV programmes, Undercover Boss or Back to the Floor, the one thing that's in every episode is that the boss is astonished by what they find, because many of the most important things have been filtered out for them before it gets to the top. You know, so unless we create a different model of leadership, and unless we recognise the need to embrace at least some aspects of democracy beyond just pure politics and in the organisational world as well, we will have great troubles. We will have big, lumbering, slow monoliths that gradually erode and collapse because they don't have the flexibility to deal with the changing world that we actually live in.
Can I just add to that as well, on the point you made about the CEO of 60,000 people not knowing everything? I think what makes you the most genuine leader in that situation is to be able to admit that. Absolutely. Because that is what people are attracted to. And it's not that you want to create this vision that you are a clueless, you know, person at the top and you don't know what's happening. The fact that you are self-aware enough and confident enough to be able to have a conversation and say, you guys are the knowledge. You know, I can pull this together, I can lead us, I can create the vision, I need your help. But that is one of the things that attracts followers to leaders, is that authenticity, that, you know, being real about your weaknesses, your gaps in knowledge. And that's a very important part around this leadership piece as well.
But you know, conventionally, sorry if I can, before leaders are often told that, you know, there's books out there, for example, called The First 90 Days. So you must hit the ground running and make big decisions in the first 90 days. To my thinking, that's exactly the wrong thing. You should be just asking questions.
This is one of the things I realized just after we saw our final proofs, the final proofs, then you can't change anything more in the book. And this is the very thing that I wanted to put in the book at that stage. There's always something that's missing from, but this 100 days myth is very toxic as well. And just in support of what you just said, we quote some recent research based on the Bob Hogan derailment patterns, which shows very convincingly with thousands of subjects in the research that the consequence of this, as you call it, Stalinist pyramid structure, is that the top leaders in our Western world, 98% of them have developed a risk area in one of the 11 derailment patterns, whereas middle managers, only 25% of them have at least one of them developed. So there are real psychological consequences which we have tried to capture with this word shadow, which comes out much more if you come closer to this shielded off top of the organization, where you can't live an ordinary human life and humane life anymore, where you can't just listen to the evidence, but you have to sit on the thrones of powers and work through treacle in terms of your understanding of the organization. And I also wanted to say in your support that in an interview this week we were discussing 2 other cases which will be more controversial in this group. Of people, any group of people, but we saw in the last few weeks the CEO of Tesco step down and the Prime Minister of Iraq. And one could argue that in both cases these people were doing exactly what they were hired for, and they were still fulfilling the term in office that they had agreed in perfectly democratic or legal ways. And I think, even in this group, if we had taken a vote, then most people would say that those 2 people should have left. In Tesco, in both cases, you can also argue that there's market forces which are much more powerful than these individuals that have created the issues that they were facing.
And interestingly enough, one of the questions some executives asked us when we say we're writing this book is, are we in it? And my answer is, we all are and we all are not. But I think there's that question about what does that therefore mean, and part of the reflection I think that we had through the process is actually noticing that there are some. It's easy to get in this downward spiral about, ain't it awful and isn't it difficult and isn't it and isn't this all problematic? But one of the things that's really encouraging and I found quite enabling was finding out in the process, working whilst we were writing, doing some of the work ourselves about our own risky areas, for example, and actually looking at some of our own patterns as part of the writing process.
Could you tell us a bit about your risky areas?
Yes, come on, Anthony.
Yeah, exactly. And as we did that work, we realized that.
I just want to ask someone to shut the doors, please. Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, that was the 2 things became pretty evident then. That like the people who have to end up leaving their jobs or having to go and so on, and the chief executives that struggle and so on, it's becoming increasingly okay. Not yet completely okay, but increasingly okay for somebody to say, I'm finding this tough. Mm-hmm. I'm the chief executive of this organization, but actually, I am really struggling here. And when I talk to the executives that I was with, they say to me, name one person who's ever done that. And in the moment, I struggled. But actually, when you look at the literature, what's published in the public domain in the last year, the number of chief executives who've taken time out because of stress and so on, and then come back to their jobs. And so now, I'm not kind of trying to create that as a model and saying that's perfect, but I think it's becoming increasingly okay to say, I need help. I think the second thing that we also noticed, certainly I noticed in looking at our own thing, is actually how so closely connected some of the things that I really know and people feed back to me as my strengths are to the things that, I can't be without them. I actually felt more understanding of myself and people around me than I did before that. And so the risk associated with, we won't talk about it or we won't inquire into this, it diminishes with the knowledge about the area.
I'm going to ask Kerry and Dennis to summarise shortly, and then I need to turn to the 2 authors to close us off. Mm-hmm. So, Kerry, would you reflect on what you've heard, what stayed with you from the last hour and a half?
I guess for me, it's very welcoming that leadership is still being talked about. I think the fact that it's been being debated for so long, and here is another book which is taking a perspective which is real, which has fantastic experience in terms of the authors behind it, understanding context of what people are really faced with now at the moment. I think what has stayed with me really from this conversation is around the different shapes and sides and faces of leadership, and long may the debate continue, because I think people, one of the questions we get asked in the classroom all the time at Ashridge is, what does a good leader look like? And it's almost they're looking for this formula to make them brilliant at what they do. And it's important that we don't ever take one or two pieces and think that we can homogenize it and apply a generic framework and it's going to work for people. I think it has to be individual, and I think people have to really get their own context in terms of how they're applying it and be very much true to who they are in order to be the best leader that they can be. So that for me has what struck.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I've enjoyed the conversation and hearing everybody's opinion, and I want to thank Anthony and Eric for inviting me to come down to Ashridge. It's been my first time here, and it's wonderful to meet you all. The other thing that leaps out at me is that when we think about the old way of thinking about leadership and where we need to move to, I think we need to stop people thinking about leadership as an issue of closure and certainty, and of everybody knowing exactly what style of leadership to adopt or what decisions to make. And I think we need to educate and encourage leaders to see the value of dissent within their organisations and become more adept at facilitating it. I think that when you have two people or more together agreeing with each other about everything, at least one of them is lying, and they probably both are lying. Because dissent is part of the human condition in reality. And the only organisational context I can think of where everybody genuinely agrees with everybody else all the time on all important issues is a graveyard. Outside that context, we do disagree profoundly, and that is actually healthy and to be encouraged. And I think if a leader is not finding that people are openly, passionately disagreeing with them regularly, then they're being told lies, and that doesn't do the leader any good. So wouldn't it be nice to move to a view of leadership where the job of the leader is not to achieve closure and distribute a sense of false certainty among their followers, but to open up dialogue all the time as the foundation of the relationship between the leaders and the followers?
Yeah, and actually, that actually resonates very, very much, and because I'm taking away a lot of new questions, and I think one of the things that I've discovered in the process of writing this, but has played out very much in this conversation, is that sense of just as you think you've got it all sorted out and you can put it in a box and say tick, you actually find that there's a bit that is open and you still have to go around that again. And I think, as Dennis is saying, this sense of recognizing that actually it's not all packed up and we're not all going to be able to agree on the definitions or whatever it is part of the joy as well as the challenge. And the aspect of actually being really truly alive. And in some respects, the whole Chinese or Indian or African thing is an opportunity for us to have that conversation afresh and to make meaning together. So I'm taking away a number of questions, a little bit of an element of saying, I wish we had been talking to you and you whilst we were writing it, but recognizing that actually there is a real opportunity in whatever we are doing and working with around leadership, where we really do need to take it out and talk to people about it as we are doing it. Write, reflect, talk, and so on. And the more conversations of this kind that we can have, the better. One of the challenges we have is having a number of people just starting out in their management, executive, whatever, working lives, and people who've been there a long time in this room having this conversation. That would be one of the things that I'll be taking away.
Eric, the last word.
I thought that was going to be you, John.
Oh, I will. I'm
not very
just
good
an
at
administrative flim-flam.
After a last word, you sort of fall over, don't you? So no, for me, that may sound silly, but that there was a conversation like this is the most moving thing today, because largely, it's been, I think I've got one here, but it's been this kind of squiggly ants on a white background for me between Anthony and myself for a very long time, until very recently, and a few other people who've seen this. But today, I've been discovering that there's actually resonance. There's criticism coming in. There's other ideas. People take it to other continents and many other ways. And that's a lot of fun to see this, become alive again. Because I think the area of thought leadership nowadays is also opening up, similar to dictatorial authoritarian leadership, where everybody publishes, everybody tweets, everybody has something to say. And this is very old-fashioned in a way, us in the background producing something and then coming out with it. And we've broken that pattern today, shared some of this. So
thank you very much, Eric. We're 2 minutes late, but there is the good news is you can buy the book for, I believe,
must be me.
10 quid. I believe it's going today. So put your orders in. And could I invite everybody to say thank you very much to our panel today. So thank you.